Welcome everyone. In this video we're going to take an overview over EF Core 5. We're also going to skip some of the changes like CosmoDB integration, tooling improvements, so this would be your CLI tools with migrations and stuff like that. Some minor changes that I didn't even deem worthy of mentioning, and some performance monitoring tools, right? Links are going to be in the description, so I'm assuming you're here because you don't read through the documentation, so I am doubting you're going to go ahead and read that, but I do recommend that you do. And generally, if you don't read documentation, this is the way that you want to watch this video. Sit back, relax, watch it, drink a cup of tea, whatnot. You see a feature that you like, or you're like, oh, that's nice. Pause the video, try it out, see what it is, get the muscle memory in, and resume the video to find the other goodies. Timestamps in the description. Let's get in. So the first feature is many-to-many relationships improvements. Before you needed to create an intermediate table, so a linker table, even with the right terminology. Now you just basically say, let's jump to the book, right? We have a human with books and we have a book with a bunch of humans. I'm using records, so it might be a little bit awkward to look at, but nevertheless, just showing that it's possible to work with entity framework with records. Records are just classes. If you want to know more about records, watch my C# 9 overview. Right. Anyway, book has humans. A human has books. Many-to-many relationship. How do we configure it in our DB context? So database context here. We just add them as DB sets. We do not have any on model creating and nothing else. All the other code in there is just to highlight other features. But all you need to know is we define our classes, we register our DB sets, and that's it. The many-to-many relationship is set up. And the way that you access it is you just literally do, we got our books, then I have this little function here to use it, just so I'm spinning up new instances of database, and then I'm just executing whatever function I need here, right? So it's just a thing that, a database operation that I'm performing, okay? So I add a range of books, I then create a bunch of humans, and I save the changes with those books, right? Let's go ahead and do some of these queries. So for example, we're going to add a bunch of books and then we're going to query them. So let's run that. And here we go. So the first thing that we have here is the query for our humans. So we have a bunch of humans where we include the books. So here we have the Bob, and then we have the two books that he has. So Foo and Bar, that's number one Foo and Bar box, and hopefully you get the picture there. And also you just get the many-to-many relationship. So whatever books or whatever humans the book contains, you just get that relationship in there straight away. And it generates the appropriate query as well. And just as an example here, where I kind of thought, right, how do you actually use records with EF Core then? And I found it pretty simple as well. So, you just query, apply whatever changes you need, and then you just say update the book, because you're not changing the key, you're just changing the title. And you can do as no tracking to start with. So whatever changes you're going to be doing to the record don't really have any performance impact. You then update it, and then you just save changes, and that is going. So you see the title here, save change, and then I query it again here, and it has changed. Okay. So for now, I will just comment these bits out to focus on the querying bits. So just to understand there, a quick recap before we move on to next features and stuff like that. I'm going to try to do these. Just a general example how to work with EF Core and records and many-to-many relationship improvements, right? So no longer do you have the intermediate table. Next thing. Split query, right? So you now have kind of as no tracking, where you're marking your query to be not tracked, right? As split query will essentially provide you a query which will be split, okay? So, as split query, the query split, what does that actually mean, right? If we say include humans, you're gonna have something like a select statement with a left join. So if a book doesn't have any humans, you're just gonna get a row with null values of humans in there with a left join, right? Split query will essentially split the query in two instead of always generating one query, right? So generally how you would use split querying is Sometimes when you have too many joins, inner joins, left joins, and your query is super massive, it gets the performance degrades really quickly. So sometimes splitting those queries out and performing them separately, however, still all on the SQL server in one call, can be better in performance. So this is just something to keep in mind as an option is open, and when you are maybe tuning performance, have a think about it, maybe splitting your queries up instead of having one massive one with a bunch of joints in there. Can be a little bit more, it can give you more performance. Next thing, there are some character operations that are now being translated. So let's say we have a title and we want to compare the first character or the first or default character. And yeah, so let's basically run this, and here you can see O and B. These are basically the entities extracted based on that, right? So we have, if we're querying books where the first or default is B, that's just going to be bar and baz. The first one is full only where the second letter is O. Okay, so these get translated into SQL substring statements. So how we have our substring in C#. SQL has its own implementation of substring, so it's nativer to SQL. So if you're doing these get translated in SQL, and if you need to perform operations on characters, just note that this is now possible. Okay. Include filter. Include filter. Let's go ahead and run this. So if we take a look at this, you can see that inside the include, I'm saying include humans where. So there is like a nested filter when in the include. So here what I'm saying is grab me all the books. I can't speak. Grab me all the books and include all the humans where the name is Lee, right? So for all of the books, foo, bar, baz, all these books which have their own respective humans that own them, they don't bring up Bob or Smith just because the name that I'm actually looking for is Lee. Okay, so it only brings me back that a Lee human that a book has, right? Which is only this book here that I'm adding, Lee's book, right? Only Lee has Lee's book. That's why it's called Lee's book, damn it, right? Anyway, there is that include filter. You can now do that, right? Don't forget, if you find something interesting, go and practice it straight away. Don't just sit there and like, oh yeah, I will remember. Yeah, you will. Not. Okay, you will not remember. Right, so that's that. So those are many-to-many records. Let's go ahead and take a look at some save changes events. So let's go ahead and take a look at this query. Again, same database operation. I am performing this on just the in-memory database. Just by the way, in case you didn't know, here I am. I have the in-memory database provider, and maybe I should have explained my whole setup. I have in my linkpad script, I have a couple of things. I have the entity framework core package. This is 5.0.1. The in-memory provider and the PostgreSQL provider. PostgreSQL examples will come later. Okay, and for the regular database, I'm using the linkpad script. For an SQL database, I'm using the NPG SQL provider. Okay, but anyway, this has nothing to do with the providers. This has something to do with the actual implementation of core. Okay, so if you will notice here, let's actually do this. This will be maybe a little bit better to showcase this feature. So if we go back here, and yep, this will save changes. So just to note, save changes events inside of here, when we perform the database operation, when we supply the database right here, when we have our database context created and injected, this would be same as if we have a controller and something is injected. You got to be careful there because it's scoped, so it might be shared between class instances during the request and whatnot, but just keep that in mind, right? When we have that instance, we can add events to it, right? So before save, we have a sender where the sender object is a database, so we can convert it to a database and then do whatever we want with the database. And here we have again the sender, which is again a database. We can do something with it. And we have the after, where the args are their own type as well. So save changes event args. They have entities saved count. So that's the kind of thing that you have here. You can bind these events and they're only valid for the lifetime of this database. So let's go ahead and check this out. Let me go ahead and run this. And here you can say book title empty, which runs somewhere here, which is a new functionality. But the other things that you see outputted is before save and after save. The important thing is that we're actually performing this many-to-many with records. So these operations as well. So if I maybe uncomment this, it will be a little bit more apparent that we did later on use the save changes again and we didn't get the retrigger of the events, right? So if I just comment this out, this first function does have the events, the second function does not have the events, right? So the events only live for a lifetime. So you're choosing where to hook the events in what scope of your application, right? Wherever you're surfacing your DB context, that's where you hook the events, okay? They're not global. So wherever you need that functionality, now you have the option to hook into that. And another minor feature that adds up, so check if entry property is mapped, where you can check the original value or current values on the entry. So for example, here I create a book, I add the book, and then I say, let me get the current entry for the book. I don't really use this feature, I just saw it was so small, I was like, right, heck, I'll just cover it, whatever. You take the entry, current values, you try to get some kind of value out, so we try to get the title out in the book, where the title is a property that exists, and out comes the value string, and the book title, it's empty, right? So whatever we set it here, it's here. So if we change it, we get empty 22, whatever, nifty. If you ever use that, if you ever need that, I don't really use entries. I try to keep my interactions with the entity framework as simple as possible. Right. Another useful thing that you have in your arsenal to show you that you've messed up somewhere is db change tracker clear. So this will clear all your change tracking. So essentially, you're tracking some changes, or you're gonna see some changes that are being tracked, and you're like, where the hell is this coming from? So you just call this thing, and it just resets it, and you're like, oh. But I'm just gonna say, if you need to use this, then you messed up. You messed up somewhere, right? I don't know where. That's gonna be somewhere in the future when you do opt-in. Just know that if you're using the if you're using the reset button, you messed up somewhere. Now, new save point in transactions. So let's take a look at it. Transactions, right? Your favorite. Everybody uses them. Maybe not. If you don't use transactions, you should try it too sometimes. Whatever. So we have a database. We begin a transaction. We start tracking changes. When we commit the transaction, stuff gets saved to the database, right? Or committed on the database site. So like this is essentially a database transaction. So let's say we create a checkpoint, just like in a video game. You create a checkpoint. It's called a save point here, but we call it checkpoint, right? In a video game, you pass a checkpoint, you go a little bit further, and then you die, and then you return to the checkpoint, right? Same thing. Here, you can return to it manually because you're kind of in control of the code, and it's the code that's returning. So if the commit, when you're if you're basically saving changes in the middle of a transaction and it fails, you will return to the last save checkpoint, or you can manually roll back in case, I don't know, another event comes in. If you're doing CQRS, whatnot, and then event comes in, you're like in the middle of a transaction. I was like, oh, well, might as well process this if you have a complex system. But nevertheless, just understand you can now put checkpoints in the middle of your transactions and roll back if you need to. Okay. So that is that. Let's go ahead and take a look at some other things that are available to us now. So coming back down, you can now create indexes with an attribute. I think you can also do it in configuration as well. So like on model creating, you can do it there. But essentially, yeah, just specify what properties you have. So for example, glass window inherit from window, where window has a type. You just specify type. If you have other properties, you can include them here. Do you require it to be unique, etc. There's your index, right? And if you don't know what a database index is, don't sweat it. This doesn't affect you. Another thing, IP address. You have an IP address property now, supported, all good. Let's move down a little bit. Yeah, so actually around the save changes events, this doesn't necessarily need to be specifically, if I can find it, hooked events here. What you can do is you can add global interceptors. So right here, you can either inherit from the iSaveChanges interceptor interface, or you kind of have like, same as if you've done any authorization in ASP.NET Core, you have the interface and then you have a base default base implementation given to you. Same as with the background services, you have the iHosted service interface and then the background service, where you usually just go and implement the base abstract class, because I mean it already has an implementation, so it's a little bit easier to work with. In this case, it's the same thing. So if you want this save changes interceptor, go ahead and implement the save changes interceptor class instead of the interface. If you want more fine-grained control, go ahead and implement the interface, you know. And then yeah, you use the builder and you add the interceptor this way. Okay, so just know that that's there. Right, where are we? So yeah, save changes, events. Yeah, let's just collapse this because I don't want to be looking at that anymore. Now, I got a bunch of windows in here and glasses and brick windows and whatnot. Let's go ahead and quickly cover this. So if you didn't know, owns property. So for example, if we have a window and the window has a frame, okay, and we don't mark the frame to be a DB set, and we say that the window owns the frame, that basically, if you think about the object structure, how you have a window and the window contains a frame inside of it, what the owns relation, basically configuration, does is it says, right, all the properties of the frame are going to be in the same table as the properties of the window, so it kind of flats it out. Okay, so that's if you didn't know that. So if we basically specify that the frame or objects are like the default value for objects is nullable, so all of these objects are optional on the on the parent object. So window may have a frame, may not, if we assign it or create it or not, right? So before, if you basically specified that a window which owns frame, so now all the properties of the frame, so for example, if frame has type, it's going to be in, if the frame, yeah, so the frame still has type, window would have two columns of type, right? One type that describes the window's type, the second column would be the type that defines the frame type. If we then go and say that on the frame, the type is required because it owns it, and kind of the relationship in the beginning where frame is possibly could be null, that kind of invalidates this requirement, because if the frame is null, this requirement can never match. So basically, if in order to specify that owned properties of an object are required, you basically gotta say, right, this navigational property frame is required as well. So then it will actually generate SQL that will say that not null values are not allowed in this column that we are injecting or grabbing from the related object that we're trying to own. Okay, so that's that configuration. Moving down here a little bit, it's probably, I'm gonna skip this one for now. Let's talk a little bit about new table per type mapping. Americans, I don't know what's up with them, they like to call it TPT, table per type mapping. I don't know what's up with the acronym, whatever. So for example, we have all these windows. We have a window, and then we have a glass inherit from window, brick inherit from window, smart inherit from window, right? So smart window, which has the IP address, and all these windows, right? All of them are separate DB sets. And what we're doing is we can now mark to table, okay? So these are all going to be their individual tables now. So the tables, glass, brick, smart, and let's say we'll have window as well. So these are 4 individual tables. Before, what would happen is the columns would be all put in the same table, and then there would be another additional type column which would decide which type you want to morph the row into. And yeah, now just know that you can basically have your object inheritance hierarchy, and then basically say, right, all of these objects just all of them have their own individual tables. This is what this part is. And now going forward, let's take a look at this, because this was a little bit confusing. But first of all, the less confusing part, if you have a field, you can see there are no getter and setters here. So getters and setters make it a property. This is a field. So now if you want to configure a field as a property, you do this. Please don't do this. Just configure it as a property. Now, specify a property comparison logic in the builder. So set value compare. So this is the function that we, in the end, that we want to arrive to. So if you're kind of a set value comparer, what does this mean? Well, set value comparer. We compare some values and we want to set the way that we compare some values. So here we provide an object. So we create a new value compare, a new way to compare values. And we say, what kind of object do we want to compare? Strings, right? So if we have a complex property, so in our case, this is a string. If we have a byte array, if we have, I don't know, a list of something, a list of books, if there is some kind of way that you want to specify how to compare those, how to basically say, has this object changed? Should we try to save this object? Should we try to update this object? This is basically the thing that will decide, has it changed? Do we need to update it? Okay, so there are 3 parameters that you can supply. Last one is optional. So the first one is to compare it, right? So here I'm basically saying on the window object, grab the type property on the metadata, let's specify the value comparer. So if we are basically comparing the old type to the new type that we said, do these equal? If not, they're different, change has occurred. The second value is a hash code. I really am not sure what this is used for, so we're just going to skip over it. For some reason that is needed. And the last bit is a comparison copy. So if you have a complex object or whatever, this is just a way for you to specify a factory, a constructor, a way to copy a value that is later going to be used for comparison in this function. Okay, so this is how you basically customize the old value, which is going to be held in memory, to compare against the new value once this is then going to be saved, right? So this can be nifty to kind of customize how you're going to be comparing and saving and change, like basically configuring change tracking for your own complex object properties of other objects, right? So, missed my leg, nearly slipped on the chair. It's not good when that happens. Getting old. Right, anything else in here? So navigate, yeah, we covered that. Let's go ahead and take a look at the SQL provider. Do I have anything in here? Short product. Let's go ahead back here. So here I have a database operation, SQL database. So the actual database is a real database in my Ubuntu box. So right here. Right, so this is a database on which it's running on port 5666. A couple of new things in here. So we have the SQL database, the actual thing. You can see how I'm querying. I'm basically saying, get the database, set the entity to be short product. This is meant to be short product. So like, yeah, just like that. Short product, we delist it and dump it. So this is what it looks like. So what is actually a short product? How do I get it? How do we compare it? Let's go ahead. Let me just collapse all of this so we don't have to keep scrolling through this thing like 10 miles. So short product, just have a name, series, slug, and then I have a constructor which just sets all of these properties to empty. When I then go to configure this in the database, I basically say, right, this short product, it has no key, and then to SQL query. So instead of a table mapping, I have an SQL query mapping. So this is where I manually specify. You can see I'm using backticks because I am on PostgreSQL and it's capital case, so I need case sensitivity. And yeah, basically I map it to an SQL query, no key. This is the entity. You can see that, well, when I'm actually mapping to this entity, There's nowhere here where I'm actually specifying it as a DB set, right? So I think this is basically going to be a replacement from query in SQL, which is going to be a breaking change. It's a little bit, I was going to say before the end, we're going to cover this one in the end, but just know that you had the from DB context database from SQL, and where you specify my query, and then you can deserialize that to your object. That is now deprecated. You now, if you want to specify an entity to be used from SQL, you try to do these sort of things, right? Or these sort of things, which we're going to get into now. So yeah, just understand if you're trying to build generic repositories, kind of like just rebuilding entity framework and proxying, this is how you can like set your type and to list it, dump it, whatever. Otherwise, other things. So shared entity types, property bags. If we don't look at the short products that we're getting, so shared entity types and property bag, specifically property bag being the dictionary, and shared entity type is that we have two DB sets that have the same type, okay? So, I mean, if you just think about it, a dictionary with string object is just a regular class where we have the property with the name, which is a string, and then the object, which is the value. I mean, it's just, the dictionary is just another object, right? It's just a different representation. So anyway, we have a DB set where we call the set function with a specific type of this property bag, as entity framework people like to call it. And we just basically specify what kind of table do we want to point to. And again, this short product, because it's pointing to products, this one is actually pointing to the same table, right? So this is actually pointing to the products database. So you can see here, if I have the name and I have the series, I'm only grabbing two here. So you can see the thing that I'm grabbing. So for example, name test, series, original, and status is one. So, but this is like key value pairs. So if I would have here test, original, and slug, here instead I'm grabbing the name, which is again the name here, series, which is the series here. So it's a little bit awkward there if you're going to be mapping stuff to dictionaries, but just know that mapping to dictionaries is now available, and just having identical objects just pointing to different tables, that can happen as well. Another couple of new things that exist now, indexer property, which basically enables this feature, and the to table is available now in here so as well. So when you have an entity, you can configure it to point to a specific table, and additionally you can also basically say excluded from migration. So if you have some kind of legacy implementation or integration, and you have your new stuff where it's code first, and then you have your older stuff, which is database first, which is legacy support, and you basically just say exclude this from migrations, and then when you're generating migration scripts and whatnot, it's a little bit easier because you're not trying to update this stuff. Okay, I mean, they shouldn't be included in migrations in the first place because there are no changes there, right? Anyway, that I think is about it for this bit here. The last bit to go over is the breaking change. And yeah, I mean, just so you're aware how you have your dictionary here. So for example, it's a dictionary type, so stock is a string object dictionary. You can still just compare, and first our default where we have a value 1,000. So it's a stock of large, quantity 0, and value of 1,000, right? So you have full support around dictionaries when creating queries. Okay, so that's that. Let's take a look at breaking changes. So we are gonna need to go all the way down here. Let me just make sure that we got this bit out here, and I will need a couple of things. So this was just an example. In my entities, I will need to bring in a field on one of my books. So break book, get the frames. This is needed for full effect. So I'm just gonna add useless commentary, which is the thing that you're listening to right now, just to kind of fill in the gap, I think. Okay, Can remove this bit as well. Okay. Okay, so what is the breaking change and how does it manifest? So let's say you have a class and then you have some kind of property, and as a default property, you decide to set the property to have a default value. What Entity Framework did before is if you query with a default property, it would just override it no matter what. Now what it will actually do is it will ignore it. Okay, so if you set a property like that for a navigational property, it will ignore it because that might be a valid property, and Entity Framework decides we're not going to waste computational power to decide if that is something we need to override, or it's basically, it just can't even know if that's something it needs to override or if it's a valid property, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at this example. So for example, the brick book that we're looking at here, what I'm doing is, instead of just having, if we take a look at the window, how we have the frame and then the default constructor of the window, I'm passing it as null. Well, in the brick window, what I'm doing is I'm overriding the base constructor where I'm passing a new frame. So what I essentially did is I created this scenario when an object gets created, I will automatically set the object to be something valid, right? So it's not a null, it is something that has a value as well. So this is something that we can inspect. And because a very common pattern to do is when you have lists on your classes, you're going to do something like this assignment. So to just basically make sure that whenever you're querying from your database and you have a null list or you didn't include the lists of the other relationship, just to understand that that still works as expected, right? So let's go ahead and run this. Here are the results. What the hell are we looking at? Let's go ahead and take a look, right? So breaking change. First thing what we do, we create a brick where we are setting the frame to Silly Billy. Okay, so we created a brick that's going to have a default value, and then we set it to Silly Billy. We then go ahead and add the brick to the brick Windows DB set, so that's added and scheduled to be written. Then we have brick 2. The second brick we created is where it has the frames. All right, so this is a list of frames. This is a separate thing. Again, this lives in a different table. Here we just create two sample frames, so like SS, S, and BBB. And this is what happens now. So we add the brick 2 and we save changes. Now, in the second part of the query, when we go and extract the data, the first thing that we're looking at are brick windows where we include the frames. So we're including the list of the frames, and we're also including the frames. So we're including both the collection and the frames, right? And then we to list it. So here it is. And then the second thing, we just list frames, right? So we have 4 to start with, where you kind of be like, we only added 1 here and we added 2 here. Where did the break come from? Well, the break came from the brick having the original initial entity set, right? So it's coming from there. So don't be alarmed. And that is now in the database, that break 1. So when we go ahead and get all the bricks, you can see that the actual Silly Billy brick that's been set on the brick here, right, isn't actually retrieved. So this is this object which doesn't have frames. And this is the breaking change. So because we have a default value set here, it is failing to set the Silly Billy brick to the frame here. So this is just something that you have to be careful of now that you're doing. And just note that if you have a list, that's not the same thing that's going to be happening with your list, okay? And this break frame here is actually valid because that's the default value that's been saved alongside with this brick, right? If we set it to null, it is actually not going to be saved. But just understand that be careful when setting this unless the default property is actually some kind of valid thing and you're intending it to be there. Otherwise, you want to omit that to avoid being in this position where you don't have a null object there and it's just not going to give you what you've saved in the database, right? So just be careful of that. And again, just to restate, the from SQL statement is actually disabled now as well. Okay, Nevertheless, hopefully you've enjoyed this overview. If you did, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions or judgments or compliments, I welcome those as well. You can leave them in the comment section. You can join my Discord channel and join the community, as well as sign up for the Stream Squad role and join me for my streams on Wednesdays and Sundays. Have a good day, and hopefully I'll see you in my other videos.